Okay, well, why don't we get started tonight? I see, oh yeah, people are trickling in quite a lot. So yeah, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. So I'm Cameron Rummel. I'm the interim curator at the Living Prairie Museum. So before we start, I would just like to remind everyone that the session is being recorded. So please just ensure you stay on mute for the duration of the event. I'd ask that you type any questions into the chat window, and I will read them out loud so that they're included in the recording. I'm going to hold all the questions until the end of the presentation, and we'll go through them at that time, but feel free to type them in anytime. It'll have a good bank of questions ready for the end. Yeah, so welcome to the third evening in the Living Prairie Museum's 5-part series of winter webinars. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd first like to acknowledge that the Living Prairie Museum and the City of Winnipeg is located in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Innu or Cree, the Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Diana Bizecki Robson, the curator of botany at the Manitoba Museum. She earned her master's degree in plant ecology at the University of Saskatchewan, studying the rare plants of the mixed grass prairies. She later obtained her PhD in soil science from the same university, focusing on the remediation of contaminated soils using native and naturalized plants. Diana joined the Manitoba Museum in 2003 and has continued her research on endangered prairie plants and wild pollinators. When she has time, she also collects fungi, lichens, and mosses to document their distribution and habitat needs in Manitoba. And so that's the topic for tonight. Diana is going to speak to us about the fungus among us and Manitoba's fungal diversity. So hi there, Diana.
Hi, Cameron.
Please go ahead when you're ready. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So fungus are one of those things that I always found fascinating, but I never really had time to study much. And then when I became the curator at the museum, I discovered that I was actually responsible for looking after the museum's collection of fungus, and I decided, well, I got to learn more about it. And coming from Saskatchewan, of course, it's actually quite dry, and you don't run into a lot of fungus. And when I came here to Winnipeg, it was like, whoa! Suddenly there was fungus all over the place, and the forests were full of it. So I had a lot of been having a lot of fun learning more about fungus, and I'm going to be talking to you about some of the interesting species that I've been coming across and that I've been enjoying learning about myself. So, there's my. Oh, there we go. Okay, so fungus is absolutely everywhere. You can find it in pretty much every single kind of habitat you can imagine. So I was like, really? It's everywhere? Yeah, it's everywhere. So we tend to think of fungus as being, terrestrial, growing on the land. And of course, growing in the soil is where we normally find it. But there are other places on land where fungus can live, including on and inside rocks. Think about that. It's living inside rocks. It's just so cool. Certain species of lichens are capable of doing that. And in fact, they actually are responsible for weathering, for creating soil, because they can do that, because they can penetrate into rocks and crack them open. But fungus occur in all sorts of other places. The air is actually full of fungal spores. Scientists have estimated that there's somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 fungal spores in every cubic meter of air, which means that with every breath you take, you are inhaling fungus. And you might be thinking, oh, but there's no fungus inside my house. And that is where you would be wrong, because there is fungus in your house. Think about shower mold. Think about athlete's foot. Think about all of the stuff that goes bad, all of the fruit. If you leave fruit on the counter too long and it starts to go moldy, that's fungus. And the reason it can infest your food is because the spores are just floating around everywhere in your house. So fungus also grow on living creatures, on and inside plants, animals, and other fungi. Scientists have been, of course, learning more about the human microbiome. And one of the things that we've discovered is there's not just bacteria living in your intestines, there's also probably about 100 different species of fungi living in and on your own body. And of course, every organism would also have their own unique collection of fungi that live on them. And in some cases, they're living on us sort of in harmony and not doing us any harm. And in fact, they're probably helping with digestion. And in other cases, they're acting like parasites. So, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Fungi are also found in water. That's an ecosystem that you don't really think of fungi being, but turns out the more scientists look for them, the more we find them in all sorts of different habitats, freshwater and in ocean environments. Pretty much everywhere we look, we find fungi. So what exactly are fungi anyway? And the reason I need to bring this topic up is because people used to consider fungi plants. Long time ago, organisms were classified into animals and plants. And plants were things that didn't move, and animals were things that were capable of movement. And as time went on, we realized, you know what, fungi aren't actually plants. They're a unique group of organisms in their very own kingdom. Unlike plants, they don't have any chloroplasts. They are typically multicellular, containing nuclei inside them, but yeasts are actually unicellular. So a few exceptions to that. One of the key things is their cell walls are made of chitin, and chitin is the same material that insect exoskeletons are made of. So in some ways, fungi all seem to be a little bit more closely related to animals than plants. Fungi all reproduce using unicellular spores. Most plants produce multicellular seeds to reproduce. And the key thing is they use what we call absorptive nutrition. So animals put food inside their bodies, but fungi put their bodies inside their food. They basically excrete chemicals to that are going to enzymes that are going to break that food down, that dead plant or whatever it is, so that they can actually take up the nutrients into their body. And because they do that, they're actually some of the most important organisms on the planet. They're basically nature's recyclers. And if fungi weren't out there digesting and decomposing all of the dead plants and animals in the atmosphere, in the ecosystem, life would basically grind to a halt. And those nutrients wouldn't be available for other organisms to use. So what do fungi eat? Basically, there's 4 main categories, kinds of things that they eat. Most fungi are what we call saprophytes. That means that they digest dead plants and animals. And I've got a photo there of our decomposer diorama at the Manitoba Museum depicting that kind of environment. Actually, it's definitely one of my favorite dioramas showing the cleanup crew. Some fungi actually poison or trap microbes like nematodes. So technically they're carnivorous. So yeah, I don't know if you've ever eaten oyster mushrooms before. I just recently found out that oyster mushrooms, when they start to run out of resources, will actually produce poison to trap nematodes. So carnivorous fungi. Some fungi actually have little snares in the soil that they set to catch these nematodes. Other fungi are parasitic on living organisms. So that means that it's not a sort of a happy, let's all live together in harmony relationship. It's one in which one organism is potentially negatively affected at the expense of the other. And I have a wonderful photo of a zombie ant fungus on the bottom that I pulled off the internet. And you may very well have heard of that particular organism. It's been in the news lately, and it's a parasite that infects ants and other kinds of insects, forces the ant to behave in a strange way, and the ant will actually climb up to a plant and chomp on the stem, and that's just the perfect environment for this fungi to produce its reproductive structure. So, very interesting organism. However, some fungi get along with other organisms a lot better than that, and they're what we call mutualists. They cooperate with algae or vascular plants, and they obtain sugar from the plant in exchange for scavenging water and minerals in the environment. And I'll talk a little bit more about one of the most important groups of mutualists in Manitoba in a bit. There we go. So the major fungal groups that we have in Manitoba, and the top group is the one I'm going to be focusing on, what we call the macrofungi. These are just very loose terms. And macrofungi are basically fungi that have large mushrooms, reproductive structures that are visible to humans, visible to the naked eye. That's all it means. It doesn't refer to a specific, taxonomic group. In Manitoba, there are about 1,448 species, although that's more than likely an underestimate. And unfortunately, we know so little about those species that most of them are not ranked. Only 466 of those species actually have a rank. That means that we have some idea of how rare or common it is. So for the vast majority of those, almost 1,000 species, we don't even know how common or rare they are, and we can't rank them. The other main group of fungi, we have the microfungi that includes things like molds, rust, and various diseases. No one's actually tallied how many microfungi there are in Manitoba, so we actually don't know. The lichens are an unusual group, or lichenized fungi. These are fungi that are cooperating with algae. They're symbiotic organisms. Some scientists think, they're probably more correctly called ecosystems rather than individuals. And they're fascinating because they can live in environments that nothing else can live in, like on bare rock shown here. There are about 600 species of those in the province, and about 258 are ranked. So a lot of them we don't really know how rare they are. And I put a photo of a slime mold there. You might be familiar with slime molds because they used to be classified as fungi. More recently, scientists have determined that they're actually not fungi. They're amoeba-like protists that are typically, for most of their life, unicellular, but they periodically come together to form these multicellular structures, such as what you're seeing there. And those structures allow them to reproduce. So I put them there just to remind you that slime molds do exist, and you may very well run into them when you're out looking for fungi. And I thought you might want to have some idea of what they are, and they are super cool. So I would suggest you learn more about slime molds because they're actually quite fascinating. So we have maybe about 87 species we know of. Again, there's probably more, and only 5 of those are ranked. So yeah, we really don't know much about slime molds. So the macrofungal structure is really not what we think it is. Most of a fungus is actually mycelium, which consists of root-like structures that are called hyphae that run through the ground. And if you've ever seen an uprooted tree, in the forest, you can sometimes see the fungal hyphae covering the roots of the tree. It's usually kind of a whitish color. The mushroom is actually the equivalent of the flower of a fungus. So just like the flower on a tree is only a very small part of the tree, a mushroom is only a very small part of the fungus. And the purpose of the fungus is to produce spores, which are produced in the gills, typically, or other reproductive structures underneath the cap. And of course, the whole thing elongates on a stalk. So one of the largest fungi that we know of is a honey fungus in Oregon that's about 2.4 miles long and is estimated to be somewhere between 1,900 and 8,650 years old. So fungi are absolutely massive, probably the largest organisms in the world. I think I heard that one fungus was estimated to weigh about as much as 3 blue whales. So that's a really big organism. So fungi, so there we go, our little reproductive chart. I just wanted to give you some idea of what happens. So we've got our little mushroom cap there. We've got our little spores dispersing, and those spores are dispersed through the air. Sometimes water aids in dispersal. Sometimes insects actually help the spores disperse. And once they manage to land on the ground, they will germinate into the hyphae. And periodically, when the conditions are right, I don't know exactly what conditions those are, but periodically there will be a fusion process to create a diploid organism, which has 2 sets of chromosomes, and it'll actually felt. That hyphae will felt together to form the little baby mushrooms, which tend to expand really quickly with water. So some mushrooms they seem to literally pop up overnight. So usually a good wet year tends to trigger a lot of mushroom growth. And certainly last year was a really good mushroom year. I was finding them everywhere. So you might have heard another fun term. You might have heard of the Wood Wide Web. That's kind of been going around the media lately, and it's referring to mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza are special kinds of fungi. Myco means of fungi, I think in Greek, and rhiza means root in Latin. And mycorrhizae are an ancient mutualistic interaction. Scientists figure that mycorrhiza have existed for probably almost since life on land began, basically. And nowadays, most plant species, about 90%, are mycorrhizal. Mycorrhizal species tend to be a little bit more common in more arid, low phosphorus soils, because those are environments where it's difficult for the plant to get enough water and phosphorus, and it's beneficial to form an association with these fungi. And mycorrhizal fungi might occur only in a certain kind of forest. So species like delicious milkcap, for example, which is a mushroom that I know a lot of people like to collect and eat. That species only associates with the roots of spruce or pine trees. So if you wanted to find delicious milkcap, you don't want to be going into a poplar forest because it's not going to be there. It has to be at least some conifers. So what does that root structure look like? Basically, the hyphae of the fungus wraps around the roots, and then the hyphae either extend in between the cells if they're ectomycorrhiza, or in some cases they might penetrate right into the plant cell, which is endomycorrhiza. And those photographs you can see on the left side, there's a fungal sheath covering a root, and the little drawing shows the little blue hyphae going right in between the cell. And that's how these 2 organisms are exchanging water and nutrients and sugars. So this is sort of a Wood Wide Web thing. So we have different kinds of fungi in the environment. So there's some fungi that are over there on the right that are saprotrophic wood fungi. So they're just fungi that decompose dead wood, and that's all they do. And then in some cases on the far left there, we've got saprotrophic litter fungi, and those are fungi that just decompose dead plants and animals, and that's all they do. The mycorrhiza, though, are connected to the plant roots, and generally the plants that are autotrophic, they make their own sugar, and the fungi will actually get some of the sugar from that plant. But then there are other plants in the environment that are called mixotrophic plants, and they are plants that actually kind of steal some of the sugar from the autotrophic plants through that mycorrhizal fungi link. And some of the organisms that do it are quite attractive. You might have heard about orchid and the mycorrhizal associations with orchids. Orchid seeds are actually so tiny that they can't even germinate without mycorrhiza. And that explains, that's part of the reason why it was so difficult to buy orchids for such a long time, because it was extremely difficult to germinate the seeds, and scientists didn't really know why they weren't germinating, why they weren't growing. As it turns out, they actually needed these fungi in order to germinate. So the species like the coral root orchids, they're actually non-photosynthetic plants. They get their sugar by basically parasitizing the trees in the forests that they grow in. So basically, they parasitize the mycorrhiza both as juveniles and when they're adults. There are other orchids that actually maybe only basically do the parasitism when they're young, until they get at least their first couple leaves, and then they'll start photosynthesizing on their own. But they still need that mycorrhiza to at least get a start in life. And scientists figured out that this was all happening because they put radio-labeled carbon, and they injected it into trees, and then they were able to track it through the fungi and into the orchids. So there's been some fun experiments trying to figure out what's going on. And we have 3 species of coral root orchids in Manitoba. They often grow in really very dense, shady habitat. So it's difficult for them to get light in that kind of habitat, and that's probably why they evolved to parasitize those trees. So fungal classification has been changing a lot in the last couple decades due to new scientific techniques. Of course, we can use DNA to understand how organisms are related now. Before, we were just using, physical similarities, and yeah, so a lot of changes, and it's much easier to figure out how things are related. So there's estimated in worldwide somewhere between 1.5 to 5 million species, but we really don't know. There's at least 7 major groups of fungi called phyla, and 2 of those groups produce large mushrooms, macrofungi, and they include the Mycota, or the club fungi, shown on top, and the Ascomycota, or the sac fungi, shown on the bottom. There are 48 orders of fungi in Manitoba, or groups, and unfortunately, I can only cover about 10 of those in this talk tonight. So I'm going to review some of the interesting fungi that we have in Manitoba. So the biggest group, the group you're probably most familiar with, are the guild mushrooms. They're the order Agaricales, and they include some edible fungi and some very, very poisonous ones. The poisonous group includes the Amanitas, and the photo there shows a sequence of death cap photos, what it looks like as it's growing. So when it's very young, it can actually look similar to straw mushrooms. And I believe there was a case, I don't know, I think it was about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where some people confused death cap mushrooms with straw mushrooms and ate them and ended up getting very sick. And in fact, a young boy died. So it's important to be very careful, and I would recommend, if you're ever thinking about going out and collecting mushrooms on your own to eat, that you make sure that you know how to identify all of the amanitas. One of the key characters is the universal veil, which occurs just under the cap, that little wavy structure. That's a pretty diagnostic character. Another key character is the little vulva at the base, so it's like a cup-like structure at the base of the fungus is a key character for that. And you could conceivably also confuse puffballs with very, very young amanitas. It's a good idea, if you're collecting puffballs, always cut them in half and make sure you don't see this little mushroom structure hiding inside. So one mushroom that is edible, although I've heard you shouldn't be mixing alcohol with it, are the shaggy manes. Those were really common in my neighborhood last year, and they've got more of oval type structure. And the interesting thing about the shaggy manes is that they self-digest. So they produce kind of an inky liquid along the edge that digests it and allows the spores to fall out. So if you are going to eat that, you of course want to eat them when when they first emerge, before they start to self-digest, because you don't want to be eating that ink. You're going to end up with black ink all over your face, and you're not going to look very good. So you probably want to collect them and eat them the same night. They're very difficult to dry because they do, once you leave them out a bit, they're yeah, they start to get all inky. So those are quite an attractive mushroom you find in a lot of lawns and boulevards. So there are a lot of gill mushrooms that do also like growing on trees, not just on the ground. And oyster mushrooms, they're probably some of the most popular edible mushrooms. You're going to find them, I don't know, maybe about um, a meter or so off the ground. So they're edible when young. And generally, as mushrooms get older, sometimes they start to produce some toxins in them. The texture is also not typically not as nice. They can start to get kind of woody or rubbery as they get older. And of course, a lot of mushrooms end up, a lot of flies lay eggs in them. So if you pick older mushrooms, they're going to be full of maggots. So not particularly appealing. So this other species, I believe that shaggy scaly cap at one point was thought to be edible, but now it's generally recognized as actually being poisonous. This is a species, I just picked this off of a stump of a tree in my neighborhood just across the street. So, but those are interesting species with these nice little fuzzy stems. So puffballs, which I just mentioned, you've probably seen in the forest. I know people often see them and they like to stomp on them and release all of the spores into the air. The ones in the forest tend to be a little bit smaller. This is a warded puffball. That one's edible. It's got little spines all over it. That one's edible. It's young. And of course, this one's already starting to mature. So the way puffballs work, when they first hatch out of the ground, when they're nice and fresh, they're kind of solid and spongy all the way through. And yes, you can cut them up into steaks and you can fry them. And but as they get older, the inside starts to turn into like billions of dust-like spores inside. And so there's a giant Western puffball on the right here, top right. That's one that's nice and fresh. That would be a good stage to eat. And after it cracks open, it just leaves sort of a kind of a rusty brown colored husk on the ground. It sort of looks like a goblet, actually. I thought somebody had thrown an old tin can when I first saw this species. So the giant Western puffball can get quite large. We have one at the museum that was 11 pounds. Before we freeze dried it. So those tend to like pastures, cow pastures or horse pastures. There's a lot of manure in sort of the prairies and parklands where you can get a lot of nice big puffballs. These two I just found out at Birds Hill Park. So yeah, so most of these mushroom photos are from places not far away from Winnipeg at all. So a really fascinating species that I just loved running into that isn't edible, but it's just so fun to find, are the bird's nest fungi. And the bird's nest fungi have this lovely little cup-like structure, and they've got these teeny weeny little spores inside. And what happens, they're actually rain dispersed. So when it rains, the raindrop hits the cup and it actually forces the spores out of the nest, and then they are ejected maybe a couple meters into the air. So the one on the left is actually dung-loving bird's nest fungi. So you can find that in that was in a cow pasture that I ran into. They're quite tiny though. I know they look big, but they're generally only about a centimeter across. So fun to find. I actually found some in my backyard one year growing on a wood chip pile. So keep your eye out for them. So another group of mushrooms that people also do really like hunting and eating are some of the porid mushrooms. A lot of the boletes are quite popular and edible. Not all of them are edible, of course. You have to find out exactly which ones you're looking for. But they have this very, instead of gills, they have these very distinctive little pore structures on the underside of the cap. It almost looks like a sponge. And so that's a diagnostic character of that particular group. And yeah, this one I found just out in like a Assiniboine forest. So them there. Probably, yeah, one of the most sought after mushrooms by mushroom hunters are the chanterelles, golden chanterelles, beautiful, wonderful flavored mushroom. And they're in a completely different order. They've got this, and then they look quite different. They've got the frills instead of the gills underneath. And related species in the same family is called sweet tooth, and you can see there's little tooth-like structures on the underside of that mushroom. That one is also edible. Another group of fungi that I love that looks very superficially like a puffball when it's young are the earth stars. So I don't know if anybody's seen the movie Alien, but you know, there's those eggs and then they kind of hatch and then the alien leaps out and catches onto people's faces. That's kind of what the earth stars remind me of, is they start out as a egg-like puffball, and then they split along those seams and expose this funny bagpipey sac structure in the middle. And this one also, the spores are actually released by rain. So when a raindrop hits the pouch of that earth star, the spores will shoot out of the tip. And those are some nice and fresh. And this is a dried specimen that we have at the museum. So earth stars, they're probably maybe could be as big as like a fried egg. Some of the larger ones. So those are super fun to come across as well. So another group of, I just love running into these mushrooms with all these fabulous shapes. This one's kind called a coral fungi for obvious reasons. It looks a lot like tropical marine corals. This particular species, Ramaria, is actually inedible. That one I found out in Assiniboine forest as well. So poke around in the leaves, you can find all sorts of interesting things. And another fascinating group are the stinkhorns. And I discovered that they were called stinkhorns for a very good reason. A volunteer at the museum once told me that he'd been for a hike also in Assiniboine forest, and he told me he saw these weird mushrooms and took a photo and wanted to know what they were. And I told him, oh, they're stinkhorns, and I don't have any in our collection here at the museum. Would you be willing to bring a couple of them in? And he said, sure. You know, he goes for a walk every day. And he comes in the next day with these stinkhorns, and I knew he was coming because I could smell them from all down the hallway. Like, and it's just like, what is that? And I was like, oh, it was Ian with my stinkhorns. And oh man, they smelled like, at first they smelled good, like a really good, strong mushroom smell. And then the rotting meat smell kind of hit my nose. I was like, ooh, that's not very good. So stinkhorns are actually insect dispersed. The cap area is covered with sort of a sticky mucilage, and because it smells like rotting meat, insects like blowflies are attracted to it. They land on it. They get this spore-laden mucilage all over their legs, and then the flies disperse it all through the environment. So yeah, anytime you smell something like rotting meat, you know flies have something to do with their dispersal. So yeah, those are interesting ones. So yeah, and the stinkhorns generally are hatching in about like September, October, so they're pretty late. You have to go for a late hike in the fall to see those. Although I've heard sometimes people get them in their compost, so I mean, you never know. So other kinds of polypores are actually, or fungi, club fungi can be quite woody because of course because they're eating wood, so they end up also kind of looking like wood. So commonly called the polypores include fungi like artist fungus, which can also get quite large. We've got just huge artist fungus in the museum's collection. And they're not edible, but they're interesting to find and observe. Chicken of the woods, though, or Laetoporus sulphureus, is actually edible when it's young. And you may very well have seen it growing on trees in the neighborhood. I usually see them every year. They're kind of a tough mushroom. They definitely have to be cooked, and you don't want to wait until they're too old because they start to get dry and they won't cook as well. But they really do taste like chicken, and they're pretty unmistakable. It's probably one of the safer mushrooms to collect. And yeah, in fact, my first exposure to fungi was somebody called me up at the museum and said, "There's an Italian fellow who wants to harvest this big yellow fungus growing on my tree," and I was wondering what it was. So I had to do some research quick to find it out. And that's kind of a neat species. So some other edible fungi that to me, I don't know, I think they look too beautiful to eat. And those are the lion's mane. Two different species here are actually related to the russulas, which is a bit interesting, but yes, just some absolutely beautiful looking coral-like and rainfall-like fungi. So the russulas, also called the brittle gills, contain some edible species, delicious milkcap. It's sort of distinctive as kind of quite a bright orange, and then it bruises to a bit of a green. So those are edible and quite delicious. But then, like leathery russula is also edible, but there are a bunch of russulas that are poisonous. So you need to be careful, particularly when you're identifying this group, because there are quite a few species that you could get confused with it. So the Lactarius has the name milkcap for a reason. It's because it produces kind of a latex. So if you're looking for them, it's a good idea to take a knife with you to score the gills or score the stems, so you can see if there's actually any of that latex inside. So another interesting group of fungi that I think just look cool are the tooth fungus, or Hydenellum. This is kind of a woody species, but it tends to grow in a forest floor area. It's inedible, but kind of interesting species. Related to it is the shingled hedgehog, or Sarcodon imbricatus. That one's edible, but apparently a bit bitter, so you might need to cook it in a special way to get rid of that bitterness. Oops. Ahead. So moving on to the next group of fungi, the sac fungi. They definitely do not have the same sort of gill-like structure as the other ones, and some of them are edible and some of them are very poisonous. So you need to be careful. Morels are one of the fairly easy to identify, but you should know the difference between regular edible morels and the false morels. So on the left we have the false morel, or Gyromitra esculenta. This one's poisonous and has actually killed people. So, but it has, I think the key thing about the false morels is they have more of a brain-like structure, the cap. Whereas the edible yellow morels on the right here, they have sort of this distinctive honeycomb texture to them, and that's sort of a good character you look for. Related species are in the family Helvelaceae. These ones are also poisonous, so and they've got sort of pretty distinctive striations in the stem there. And often the cap is kind of an unusual wonky shape to them. So make sure you know your morels from your false morels. So another group of sac fungi include, I don't know, I just think these are just so fun to run into when you're in the forest. They're called dung cups or scarlet cups, and these are dung cups. I don't know, I think they look more like little ears to me, but they tend to grow on fallen logs. And some of them can be, yeah, about the same size as an ear. Some of them are really tiny and quite delicate. Scarlet cup. So not edible, but again, really super fun to learn. So another interesting group of fungi are in this are the flask fungi. And flask fungi are one of those fungi that actually parasitize other fungi. So you might have heard this structure called a lobster mushroom. That's actually the species is Hypomyces lactuiflorum, and that species parasitizes other species of fungi. In this case, it's parasitizing a Lactarius. So I say edible with caution because as long as it's parasitizing an edible species, then it's edible. But if it happened to have parasitized an inedible species, then it's obviously not going to not going to be edible and could actually make you sick. So yeah, so this is edible with caution. You should you need to identify basically the species that's parasitized before you would eat it. So for me, it's not kind of the kind of fungi I think a beginner should be messing around with yet. Well, I'm going to move on for a little bit. I'm going to talk about our mutualist fungi, lichenized fungi, for a bit. So scientists, well, first of all, didn't even believe that mutualism existed, but eventually they were convinced that, hey, yeah, there's an algae in there. And what scientists are finding now, there is not just lichen and an algae in there, there's sometimes cyanobacteria in there. They're now finding that there are sometimes yeasts mixed in, there are bacteria and even viruses that are all living together in these lichens. So it's basically an ecosystem of tiny organisms all living together, which is absolutely fascinating how that can happen. So most fungal partners are sac fungi, like the morels we saw. Most of the algal partners are either green or yellow-green algae. And both partners can be free living in the environment. And so basically, periodically, the algae and the fungus might just encounter each other in the wild and then decide to form a lichen, basically. But the advantage of joining up together is that both organisms can grow in habitats where neither species could live alone, such as on bare rock. Most lichens are inedible, although I have heard of a few species sort of being used as starvation food or lost in the woods food, but they're not particularly nutritious. They're just beautiful, and there's a whole bunch of different species just in this photo. There's some little pixie cups there. There's a dog lichen. There's a bunch of crusty lichens on the rock there, and and lichen reproduction is also really fascinating and kind of bizarre because the fungal component of the lichen can reproduce sexually by creating spores called apothecia. It's a couple different kinds, but apothecia is pretty common. But if the lichen does that, then it's just the fungus component that's being dispersed. That fungus is going to have to find a new algal partner in order to become a new lichen. So for that reason, lichens also reproduce asexually using structures called seridia and various other structures. And by doing that, both partners can disperse. So the little propagules, asexual propagules, actually have a little bit of fungus and a little bit of algae, and maybe there's even some yeast in there, and they all disperse together to form a new habitat, and then they can form a whole new lichen. And so what you're seeing there in those two photos are some of the reproductive structures of two different species. There's a British soldier there, called that because they have those little red reproductive structures. And the powdered sunshine lichen, which is just a beautiful, vibrant yellow. And it's got the reproductive structures just along the wrinkly little edges of the lichen. So the lichen growth forms enable better access to light, and that's why in some cases they sort of almost seem to be similar to corals because corals are also trying to get light. Corals are also symbiotic organisms, although in that case it's an animal with algae inside. Lichens are a fungi with algae inside. And the reason they have those coral-like growth forms is because that allows better access to light by having that structure. So there are four main growth forms of lichens. Some lichens are crustose, uh, crust-like on a substrate. Some of them are squamulose or scaly. Some are foliose, which means they're leaf-like and sort of flattened. And then some of them are fruticose, which means they're branched and shrubby. I'm just going to show you a few photos. So crustose lichen can occur. I mean, we find them super common on trees. I can't think of a tree that I encounter, in the forest that doesn't have some lichen growing on it. And you'll get different species growing on different kinds of trees. The ones that grow on hardwoods are different from softwood. And sometimes there's differences in terms of where on the tree they grow. Some lichens like to be near the base, some of them like to be higher up. Field lichens are one of the more common lichens on rock. And a crustose lichen and the structure of it, basically you've got the substrate, the tree or the rock, and then there's sort of a spongy layer called the medulla. And then there's a layer of algae that's just under a cortex, an upper cortex, which basically protects the algae from UV rays. But so the algae is just sort of high up enough that it can get enough light through that cortex layer and actually reproduce. And lichens are extremely slow growing. Even just a small lichen could be thousands of years old. They can really only grow maybe a few millimeters in a year. They can only grow when they're wet, so they spend huge amounts of their lifetime just being dormant. And then, of course, a wonderful time to go for a walk in the forest is actually right after it's rained, because then the lichens are all, they've absorbed the water and they're actually photosynthesizing and reproducing and doing all sorts of wonderful things that lichens do. So this is a kind of squamulose lichen. This one's called blushing scale. In general, the squamulose lichens aren't the most common growth form we find in Manitoba. Tend to find a lot more crustose ones. And they have a pretty similar structure. The main difference is just that they're attached, not attached solidly all the way through. The edges are sort of sticking up a little bit. Foliose lichens include dog lichens, which are pretty common on the forest floor in Manitoba. They kind of have a pelty look to them. They tend to, when they dry up, when it's dry, they tend to look kind of blackish, and then when it rains and they get wet, they typically turn kind of a bright green, and they can form really quite huge rounded structures. Shield lichens, those are pretty common on softwood tree trunks. And the difference between them is they have an upper cortex. They also have a lower cortex. They've got that algal layer and that medulla. But then they've got these little root-like structures called rhizonae that attach them to the substrate. So they're a little bit easier to actually pry up than the crustose lichens. If you wanted to collect a specimen of a crustose lichen, you'd need to use a chisel to remove a chunk of rock. But shield lichens can be a little easier to collect. And then we have a fruticose lichens. This is the most common one, reindeer lichen, or people call it reindeer moss, but it's not actually moss. It's a species of Bladina, and they're just beautiful to encounter in the wild. They will actually also, fruticose lichens, just disperse asexually. So if an animal steps on a fruticose lichen and breaks a fragment off, it'll actually just keep growing and become its own lichen. I used to worry about that when I was hiking, because I'd be like, oh no, I crushed this lichen, but it can actually grow from, like, regenerate itself into a whole new lichen. So still, it's I prefer to try and leave nature looking as pretty as it is. So, and so the way that basically, has a branch-like structure. So there's basically the cortex all the way around, and then an algal layer right under it. mandala right in the center. So a little bit on lichens there. Like to just start wrapping things up a bit. One of the things that always concerns me is that there are a lot of mushroom myths out there. You might have heard that only red mushrooms are poisonous, or that peeled mushrooms are safe to eat, or that poisonous mushrooms will taste bad, or that animals won't eat poisonous mushrooms. Cooking destroys mushroom toxins, or this one's kind of weird. If a dye placed in a cooking pot turns black, the mushroom is poisonous. These are all wrong. They're all wrong. Lots of white mushrooms are poisonous, and peeling mushrooms doesn't help. And cooking does not destroy mushroom toxins. They're still in there. This species, the fly agaric, is I think the one when people think, oh, poisonous mushrooms, this is sort of the one that pops into their head. But no, there are lots of mushrooms that are poisonous that are not red. So there really are no shortcuts or rules of thumb. If you want to collect edible mushrooms, you need to learn how to identify both the edible and the highly poisonous mushrooms, because you don't want your foraging to result in a funeral. So only eat mushrooms that you're 100% certain that you have identified correctly. Generally, it's a good idea to avoid old mushrooms for some of the reasons I suggested. Sometimes toxins get worse over time. Plus, they're not going to taste as good either. I also recommend that you keep at least one whole mushroom, the underground part as well, intact. Don't eat one of them, and because that one you can take to the hospital if you happen to get sick. At least you'll have a specimen that the toxicologist will be able to look at to determine what kind of treatment you need. Because if you've obviously different kinds of mushrooms have different symptoms. The amanitas, for example, they will make you very sick for a period of maybe 12 hours, 12 to 24 hours, and vomiting and diarrhea, and you'll feel really terrible. But then people feel better, and that's a very dangerous thing, because people tend to think, oh, I just ate a few bad mushrooms, now I'll be okay. But in reality, if you ate an amanita, the toxins are actually destroying your liver. And so there's just sort of a lull in which you don't feel sick anymore. Maybe you won't go to the hospital, but the toxins are destroying your liver. And one of the only ways, one of the treatments for amanita poisoning is to get a new liver, actually, which I don't think anybody wants an emergency liver transplant. So anyway, it's a good idea to have a mushroom that you haven't eaten laying around. Now, one good thing that you can do to help definitively identify mushrooms is to learn how to make spore prints. And spore color can help you identify a lot of the gilled and pored mushrooms. Amanitas have white spores, so it's a good thing to do. And the way you do a spore print, you can remove the stem from the mushroom and place the mushroom cap face down on. I like using black or blue paper rather than white paper, because a lot of mushrooms do have white spores, and white on white isn't going to show up very well, but it will show up on black. Most spores are kind of pink or purple or brown, mostly brown. Some of them are white. So once you've got that cap laying on that sheet of paper, you can cover the whole thing with a big bowl or a glass and leave it for a few hours or overnight. And then carefully lift up that bowl and that glass and lift the cap straight up, and you'll have this wonderful little spore print behind. And you'll know exactly what spore color you have, and you can use that to help key out your mushroom. Actually, I would love to see artwork done with spore prints. I don't know if there's any artists out there, but I would love to see spore print art. That would be fascinating. So at the Manitoba Museum, we have a scientific collection of mushrooms. We've got over 700 specimens of lichens, representing about 43% of all species in Manitoba. We also have over 500 specimens of mushrooms, but that's only about 7.4% of all species in Manitoba. So our diversity isn't great. There's very little data to base species rarity ranks on, as I referred to before. So for those mushroom enthusiasts out there, you might want to consider donating identified preserved specimens. You know, we would love to get some more well-preserved species in our collection. If you are going to be collecting and donating a specimen, I'd ask that you collect at least 2 entire mushrooms. A spore print is great as well if you collect one. They should be stored in a paper bag, obviously not a plastic bag because they start to go moldy. However, since I'm not always in, it might be a good idea to dry the mushroom ahead of time. So you can dry mushrooms using the commercial dehydrator. You can buy those little devices. You can put wire mesh over a radiator in front of a fan to dry it out quickly. You could put silica gel in a lidded container, like we see on the right. And that silica gel, that's the same stuff that you can that you get in shoe boxes, but you can buy big jars of it, and it'll help dry your mushrooms really quickly. Or you could use an oven temperature. And if you are going to be donating mushrooms, though, they're not very useful to me unless they have data with them. And the kind of data that I collect on all of my mushrooms, and that I would like to get from anyone considering donating specimens, include the date when you collected it, your name, any photographs or line drawings, if possible, just so we can see what the mushroom looked like when it was fresh, because of course its color changes a lot as you dehydrate them. Location is good, habitat, descriptive notes or measurements. Habitat, if you can include information about the substrate it was growing on, if it's growing on rocky area or on soil, if it's on a living or a dead tree, and where on the tree it grows, what the light level's like, is it sunny, is it shady, moisture level, and the vegetation type is that's all really useful information and helps when you're identifying. So descriptive notes and measurements, things like the size of the mushroom. Of course, when you dry a mushroom, it shrinks a lot, so you really don't, it's a little bit harder to identify. Color, scent is actually quite important in identifying mushrooms. Cap shape, whether it's rounded on top or flat or pressed. Presence and color of any latex in the stem is a diagnostic character for a lot of species. And also the texture of the gills. A lot of times, sometimes the gills are very brittle. In other species, they're kind of stiff and waxy. So you can, all of those sorts of characters are helpful in identifying them. So a couple of resources I wanted to mention. There's all sorts of, quite a few good mushroom field guides you can get out there. I'm not going to mention one, but I will mention a website that I really do enjoy, which is mushroomexpert.com. That's got a lot of good photographs and keys and good advice. If you're interested in learning more about lichens, Lichens of North America by Brodo, Sharnoff, and Sharnoff is an absolutely amazing book. It's expensive though, it's really big and thick, but man, if you're interested in learning more about lichens, that is a book you've got to get. I also would recommend these 2 books. They're natural history books about fungi. Entangled Life is probably one of the best natural history books I've ever read, and it's all about some of the new things that we've learned about fungus and slime mold in the last couple of decades. It's just a wonderful read. I also really liked Magical Mushrooms and Mischievous Molds by George Hudler. That one's a little bit more focused on how fungus has impacted humans. So he has a whole chapter, for example, about the Irish potato famine. He talks about LSD, has a whole chapter on LSD and how that came about, and it's just a really fun read if you're interested in mushrooms. So I also just wanted to mention a few things about the Manitoba Museum. If you haven't been there in a while, there's a lot of new stuff to see. We've renovated, over 60% of our gallery space. So the Nonsuch Gallery was renovated in fall of 2018. The Winnipeg Gallery was renovated in the fall of 2019, and the Welcome and Prairies Galleries opened in spring of 2021. So if you haven't been to the museum in a few years, we have some new exhibits about plants, and there's some wonderful fungi there. We got a puffball trio showing the 3 stages of puffballs. And yeah, I'd invite you all to come and enjoy our new exhibit. And with that, I guess we can go with some questions. There's my email, my phone number. So if you want to send me some questions afterwards, maybe you're laying in bed tonight and you have an urgent question about fungi that you need to do that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Diana. That was spectacular. And you mentioned Assiniboine forest. I've seen a few of the species that you showed there in the past. I didn't know what they were. So that's going to be really good to go back there, and now we'll know what I'm seeing. Yeah, let's dive into some questions. Feel free, anyone, to type the questions into this chat, and I'll just read them aloud so we make sure we get to all of them. So I guess we had a question from Darcy. It was, where can one view the ranked mushrooms of Manitoba?
Actually, anybody can go to it's a Wild Species 2020 report. I think if you just type in Wild Species 2020, you'll get the most recent report. There's actually a database that you can download, and then there's a report which basically interprets it, and that has the data list has every species of animal, every plant, and the fungi, the macrofungi at least are in there, not the microfungi, and it'll have the ranks for all of them. So
okay. And Annalise asked, do flies lay eggs in mushrooms due to their high protein and moisture content?
Yeah, that's probably a pretty safe bet. So yeah, a lot of mushrooms a lot of flies in particular really like moisture kinds of habitats, and they they'll lay their eggs in anything sort of decomposing. But yeah, and it tends to be the softer mushrooms. You don't really see the maggots like you wouldn't see them in the polypores because it's a little too woody for them. But yeah, fungi are very moist. So like really, it's mostly water. When you dehydrate, I mean, some mushrooms more than others, but like with those stinkhorn mushrooms, there was hardly anything to them once I totally dehydrated. So.
So the next question is from Wendy. So a puffball is not a sac fungi?
No, it's technically it's in the in the group with the gills. It's a gillless gilled mushroom. That's kind of funny. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, and Darcy asked, have you seen or heard of lion's mane growing here in Manitoba?
I mean, it's in the province. I haven't seen it myself. So yeah, I don't know a good habitat would be.
Okay. And Annalise asked, are early morels edible?
As far as I know, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the morels are interesting because they, like a lot of fungi, need water in order to grow, but the morels have that forest fire trigger. So I know people often pay attention to where were forest fires burning, so they can go to that area the following year, because there's usually a lot of.
Okay, and then Kate asked, do the lobster mushrooms exclusively grow while parasitizing other mushrooms?
Exclusively grow parasite, like, yeah, that's probably going to be like their reproductive stage. So yeah, it's a bit, I'm certainly not an expert on how that whole parasitism works. I'd love to read more about it. But, yeah, I think they're waiting for I don't quite know exactly how that, why they decide to parasitize some mushrooms and why not. Presumably it has to do with whether there's enough spores in the habitat. So Yeah, no, that's something you'll have to, you know, find another find another mushroom person who knows more about it than I do.
Well, it's super interesting. I didn't know they parasitized, if they parasitize a poisonous fungi, they could become poisonous themselves. That's
Yeah.
important to know. Um, Caitlin asked, have you tried all the mushrooms that are edible? And also, I guess, two-part question. What is the difference between poisonous versus inedible?
No, I haven't tried all of them. I mostly stick with the chanterelles and the chicken of the woods, and rolls, and um, yeah, the bacteria. So, but usually the problem with me is that when I find mushrooms, I usually want to collect them and take them into the museum's collection instead of
Yeah.
eating them. So yeah, so I tend to the mushrooms I've eaten have mostly been collected by somebody else. Yeah. So the difference between poisonous versus inedible has to do, well, poisonous mushrooms can actually taste very good. Um, and those are poisonous ones are producing a toxin that is negatively going to affect the body and can cause illness. Something that's inedible is either basically too small, or it could be that the texture is not very nice, or it could be that they just don't taste very well. They could be very bitter. So you just the inedible ones you wouldn't want to eat, or it could be very woody. Um, yeah, it's just not like I guess you could try eating it if you wanted to break some teeth. Yeah,
So essentially, it's the difference between whether it's dangerous or just not good to eat at all.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Might not be poisonous, but you wouldn't want to eat it because it would taste terrible.
Yeah. Troy asked, for beginner foragers, what are the 5 top recommended mushrooms to research or to start looking for in Manitoba? I guess so fairly common or easy to identify.
Right. Yeah, there's a couple different species of morels. There's a black morel and a yellow morel. Um, those are good. If you can find chanterelles, those are pretty straightforward. The chicken of the woods ones I'd recommend. The shaggy manes are also pretty easy to tell apart. There is a type of inky cap that isn't edible, but it doesn't have that cup-like structure. And what else would I pick? Is that 4 or 5? Um, some of the what else would I pick? The puffballs for sure. I think I would say.
Okay. And Denise had a question. Are all the fungi you're discussing found in Manitoba?
Yes, yes, they are. So, um, and Manitoba is a really big, a really big place. So, there's lots of places where you can find.
Okay. And Jen asked, what are some good foraging locations for beginners near Winnipeg? And then I saw someone else followed up. Depends what you're looking for, but any park or in Winnipeg or Manitoba will have fungus. But also noting that mushroom foragers are secretive about their foraging spots. But yeah, I guess, do you know any good foraging locations?
It's kind of funny because I found a lot of edible mushrooms even just in my neighborhood. Um, so Assiniboine Forest is actually kind of a nice place. Birds Hill Park has some nice populations. And I was wondering, I believe it's okay to collect mushrooms if they're for your own consumption in provincial parks. You're not allowed to collect in national parks, so no mushroom hunting and running or out of which is a
Oh,
little bit
that's
far anyway, but yeah, but I believe in provincial parks. I think if you were if you were going to be collecting mushrooms commercially and selling them, then I believe you need a permit. But if
right.
you're just collecting a bucket and you're going to fry them up and have them for dinner, then that's acceptable. Although I recommend that people not, collect every single mushroom in the habitat because it's nice to leave some fungi out there to actually reproduce. Otherwise, you're over collecting. That might have a fungus.
Yeah, remember your stewardship. Diana, you were cutting off a little bit there at the end of,
Oh,
maybe just lean a little close. Yeah, thank you.
I'll
There
move a
you go.
little closer.
Yeah. Um, Kate asked, are there certain species of mushrooms that you are looking for the Manitoba Museum collection?
Yeah, I don't, um, you know what, there really aren't a lot of specimens of any species. So pretty much anything you can bring me is probably going to be a species I either don't have or I only have a few specimens of. And it's nice to have, I find that it's nice to have at least, you know, 5 specimens of any one species just to get some idea of what the distribution of it is. Things that it's a little difficult to bring things that self-digest in, so the inky caps are kind of hard to preserve. Anything that's a little bit woodier is probably would be a great thing to bring in because then it's you know it's not going to go bad so quickly in between the time you collect it and when you can actually bring it to me. Or I don't actually have a lot of boletes, a lot of the pored mushrooms or the toothed mushrooms. So yeah,
Okay.
things that are unusual, things that are unusual are good.
Well, I'd imagine you're talking to the right group. You hopefully get something good. Um, there was a question from Denise. Are there any mushrooms that are dangerous just to touch or smell? Like, can you be poisoned through the skin or only if you eat them?
Um, Pretty much only if you eat them. That said, you might have heard of this disease called blastomycosis. And that the species that causes that disease lives in well, it's most common in the Lake of the Woods area. And a number of people have gotten sick with blastomycosis because they inhaled the fungal spore and it actually basically kind of starts growing in your lungs and can cause a pneumonia type illness. Um, and in some cases, dogs have also gotten this blastomycosis. So if you're ever in the Lake of the Woods area, maybe if you have a cabin out there, or really anywhere in Manitoba, if you're handling, rotting wood or digging in the ground, it's probably a good idea to wear like a respirator or a mask to prevent yourself from inhaling those sorts of fungal spores. And always, beware if you end up getting like a weird chest cold or a flu, it's possible that you might have this blastomycosis, and it's something you should share with your physician, just in case. It's pretty rare to get it, and in most people, healthy people at any rate, um, you probably wouldn't be negatively affected, but people, especially people who are immune compromised in any way or diabetic, they tend to be more susceptible to getting these sorts of fungal diseases. So that's what you should really be cautious about in particular. Um, yeah.
Oh, good. And yeah, sort of a related question, I guess, from Denise. If you make a spore print of a poisonous mushrooms, is there any potential for being poisoned by that, or like would washing your hands after make it safer?
It's a good idea to wash your hands anyway. You don't probably don't want to be licking your fingers or anything afterwards. So it's a good idea to do it. But I don't think I haven't heard of anybody getting poisoned from eating spores,
Okay.
breathing it. So
And Chelsea asked, what chanterelle lookalikes should people be aware of in Manitoba, if any?
geez, I'm kind of racking my brain. I'm not quite sure what you could confuse with a chanterelle. They're pretty distinct. Yeah, so I'd have to, if anything. I got a field guide with me here, but find it around. Maybe. Yeah, Yeah, no, there are not really a lot of mushrooms that I think you confuse with it. That bright yellow color and those folds underneath is pretty distinctive. Most of the bulk of our mushrooms are gilled. So yeah, check a good
Um,
field guide would mention anything, but yeah, I just pretty distinct.
and then a question about bird's nest fungi in Manitoba. Do you know of any good places to look for bird's nest fungi other than cow dung?
Wood chips.
Wood
If you see
chips.
mulch, yeah, sometimes I found them on mulch. Um, just in a shady spot. Yeah,
The wood chip pile at Assiniboine Forest.
wood chip pile.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I like they literally were growing in my backyard and collected them, brought them into the museum and the cow dung. They're a little hard. They're quite tiny, so they're easy to miss.
Okay, and a question from Tyler. What is the best way to identify the fungi a lobster mushroom is parasitized? Like, will the old fungi even
Yeah,
be identifiable?
well, if it's, I mean, one thing you can narrow it down is if it's a lactarius or not, is whether that latex is there. So that's why it's a good idea to have the knife to score it. Yeah, that's pretty tricky. Oh, somebody said I read that. Oh, okay. So I'm just reading in the chat that somebody has picked them and never had any issues before. So I've read that lobster mushrooms only parasitize non-poisonous mushrooms. Even if they are poisonous, they change the DNA enough so they're no longer poisonous. Okay. I
Interesting.
had not heard that. So yeah, if there's someone who knows more about lobster mushrooms than me, should probably be consulted on that. But
Yes, do your research.
yes.
Um, Tyler asks, what's our deadliest species? Strictly for informational purposes, of course. Let's hope.
Yeah, I have heard of a urban or a rural legend about a woman who supposedly got rid of a couple of her husbands by feeding him the wrong kind of mushroom. I guess it would be the death cap amanita. That one's probably the worst. So yeah, that one. Yeah, I think the amanitas are the worst, and then that the Gyromitra would be or the false morels. So some of the other ones I think are mostly would make you sick, which is not fun, but probably are not going to kill you. But the amanitas, yeah, they're the worst. They eat your liver. I mean, you can't like a mushroom that eats your liver.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Well, looks like that was, I'm just checking if I missed any questions. I think that's it. So yeah, well, thank you again so much, Diana. This was a spectacular presentation. Super interesting content. And I think, gives a lot of people at least a foot in the door to start their research. I know it's hard to just pick up a field guide and just start from nothing, but when you have someone kind of show it like you did, it helps get started. So
yeah,
yeah.
I would recommend getting some good field guides, spending some time looking through them, and then it's just great, go on hikes in the forest and take photos of what you find, and then use your books and learn more about it. And there are some people who give like actual foraging workshops, so I'd recommend searching out those people, and because that's extremely useful to have some hands-on help in identifying that. So yes, so please be safe. Don't eat anything unless you're 100% sure what it is. And then, and even if you're not eating, just enjoy photographing them. I see so many wonderful photos that people take of mushrooms, and it can be a wonderful hobby too, just photographing and hunting them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. I'd just like to mention that, we'll be sending out a link to this recording to Friends of Living Prairie members. I'd also like to mention the next session on March 7th. So it's with John Morgan, prairie ecologist, where he'll be discussing an ecological approach to planting native species. and I posted the link in the chat a couple times there. Yeah, so in other words, how to plant a native garden as a functioning ecosystem. So registration's open now. Oh, and I just saw one last question before we finish for the night. Denise is asking, could you email a list of what we should record if we're going to bring in a species for the museum? We could probably do that. Maybe I'll either talk with Diana or I could take it from the presentation and email it out. I think that would work. Yeah, that'd be great. Okay. Well, thanks again, Diana. Thank you to our ASL interpreter as well. Yeah, spectacular talk, and have a good night, everyone. Nice to see you.
Yep. Thanks
And
for
you got
coming. Have a good
lots
evening.
of thanks in the chat too.